His name was an insult he would make the world remember. In the language of the Nguni peoples, Shaka referred to an intestinal beetle, a parasite, a thing of shame. When Nandi's belly began to swell, and elders from the Zulu clan demanded an explanation, her people insisted she was not pregnant, but merely afflicted with this intestinal condition. It was a desperate lie to cover a desperate situation, and when the child arrived around 1787, the name stuck like a curse. The boy would carry it for the rest of his life, a reminder with every utterance that he had been unwanted from the moment of his conception. The circumstances of his birth violated customs that held Nguni society together. His father, Senzanga Kona, was chief of the Zulu, but the title meant less than it sounded. The Zulu were a minor clan, perhaps 1,500 people occupying a small territory in the rolling grasslands between the Drakensberg Mountains and the Indian Ocean. Dozens of similar clans dotted the landscape, each with its own chief, its own cattle herds, its own traditions. The Zulu were one voice in a chorus, and not a particularly loud one. His mother, Nandi, came from the Elangeni clan. Under normal circumstances, a marriage between the two families would have been unremarkable. Chiefs regularly took wives from neighboring groups to cement alliances, but Senzanga Kona and Nandi were of the same clan grouping, related distantly enough that marriage was technically possible, but closely enough that their union skirted the edges of propriety. When Nandi became pregnant outside of formal marriage arrangements, what might have been overlooked became scandal. Senzanga Kona eventually took Nandi as a wife, legitimizing the child, but the damage was done. The boy born under a cloud of shame would be raised in a household where he was tolerated rather than celebrated, a living reminder of his father's indiscretion. He had half-brothers whose mothers occupied positions of greater respect, whose claims to succession faced no asterisk of doubtful origins. Shaka was a chief's son, but barely. The household did not hold together long. Nandi was proud, fierce, and utterly unwilling to accept the subordinate position that scandal had assigned her. She quarreled with Senzanga Kona's other wives. She demanded recognition for her son. She made herself intolerable to a husband who had never fully wanted her in the first place. When Shaka was perhaps 6 years old, Senzanga Kona sent them away, back to the Elangeni, back to Nandi's people, back to a world that would prove no kinder than the one they had left. Exile taught the boy lessons that privilege never could. Among the Elangeni, Shaka and his mother were dependents rather than family. Mouths to feed, obligations to endure, reminders of a shameful episode that the clan would have preferred to forget. The boy herded cattle alongside other children, but was never fully one of them. When a dog killed a sheep under his watch, he was beaten and humiliated in ways that the sons of respected families would never have experienced. When he fought back against the other boys' taunts, he earned reputation as a troublemaker rather than praise for spirit. He grew large. Contemporary accounts describe him as tall and powerfully built, physically imposing even as a youth. In a culture that prized cattle wealth and martial prowess, his body was an asset, but an asset that others feared rather than admired. He was too big, too intense, too clearly harboring resentments that he had learned to mask but could not eliminate. The other children sensed something coiled inside him, something that made mockery feel more dangerous than it should have been. His mother was his world. Nandi endured the same slights he did, the same reminders of their precarious position, the same dependence on the grudging hospitality of people who wished them elsewhere. Whatever love Shaka learned to feel, he learned from her. Whatever loyalty he understood through her. She had given up everything for him, her position, her comfort, her future. And he absorbed that sacrifice into the foundation of his identity. To betray Nandi was to betray Shaka. To harm her was to make an enemy who would never forget. The Elangjeni eventually tired of their difficult guests. Nandi and Shaka moved again, this time to the Kwabe, another clan where they had distant connections, another place where they would be tolerated rather than welcomed. The pattern repeated: dependence, humiliation, survival. Shaka learned to read the politics of every household, to identify who held real power and who merely appeared to understand the difference between what people said and what they intended. He learned to wait. The broader world beyond his immediate hardships operated according to rhythms that had governed the Nguni peoples for generations. Cattle were wealth, status, and meaning. A man's herds determined his ability to marry, his standing in the community, his legacy to his sons. Clans raided each other for cattle, young men proving their courage by driving off livestock and earning the right to marry. The violence was ritualized, limited, almost ceremonial. Warriors threw long spears called assegais from a distance, exchanged insults, and withdrew when honor had been satisfied. Deaths occurred, but were not the primary purpose. The goal was cattle and glory, not extermination. Shaka watched and remembered. He saw how warriors fought, how leaders commanded, how power shifted between clans through marriage and alliance and occasional sharp violence. He heard the oral traditions that connected his people to ancestors stretching back beyond memory. Stories of great chiefs and famous cattle raids and the proper way to live as a Nguni man. He absorbed the culture that had shaped his mother and father and all the people who had mistreated him since birth. But he also saw its weaknesses. The throwing spear was a weapon of display rather than decision. The ritual combat that limited casualties also limited results. Clans rose and fell, but the fundamental pattern remained unchanged. Dozens of small chiefdoms competing endlessly without anyone achieving dominance. The system perpetuated itself precisely because it was designed to perpetuate itself, to prevent any single leader from accumulating enough power to threaten the independence of all the others. Shaka, the boy whose name meant parasite, the exile who had been driven from 2 clans before he reached manhood, looked at this world and saw something that perhaps no one else could see. He saw that it could be broken. Around 1803, when Shaka was approximately 16 years old, he and his mother found refuge among the Mthethwa, a confederation of clans ruled by a chief named Dingiswayo. The Mthethwa were more powerful than any single clan, a new kind of political organization that was beginning to reshape the landscape of southeastern Africa. Dingiswayo had built something larger than a chiefdom, but not quite a kingdom. A collection of subordinate groups that owed him allegiance while retaining their own identities. Shaka entered Mthethwa's service as a young man with nothing. No cattle, no father's support, no clan standing, no future except what he could carve with his own hands. He joined an age regiment called the Izikwi, one of the groups of young men organized by birth year who lived, trained, and would eventually fight together. He was done being a victim. He was done being an insult given flesh. The world had spent 16 years teaching Shaka what it meant to be powerless. Now he would begin learning what it took to become powerful beyond anyone's imagination. The grasslands of Zululand stretched toward the horizon, endless and green after the summer rains, waiting for the man who would drench them in blood and glory. Dingiswayo was unlike any chief Shaka had ever encountered. The leader of the Mthethwa Confederation had a vision that extended beyond cattle raids and clan rivalries. Where other chiefs saw the world as it had always been, small groups competing endlessly for livestock and prestige, Dingiswayo imagined something larger. He wanted to unite the Nguni peoples under a single authority, to end the constant petty warfare that kept everyone weak, to build a power that could dominate the entire region between the mountains and the sea. The stories about how he developed these ideas varied. Some said he had traveled far from his homeland as a young man, encountered European colonists at the Cape, and returned with new concepts of political organization. Others attributed his innovations to native genius, a mind that simply saw further than his contemporaries. Whatever the source, Dingiswayo had spent years assembling a confederation that subordinated neighboring clans without destroying them. Chiefs who submitted kept their positions but acknowledged Mthethwa supremacy. Those who resisted were crushed and replaced with more cooperative leaders. It was a new kind of power, and Shaka absorbed its lessons hungrily. The age regiment system that organized Mthethwa military life gave structure to young men who might otherwise have drifted into trouble. Boys born within a few years of each other were grouped into regiments called Amabutho, living together, training together, forming bonds that transcended clan identity. They could not marry until the chief gave permission, could not establish independent homesteads, could not accumulate the cattle wealth that would make them men in the traditional sense. They belonged to their regiment, and through their regiment, they belonged to Dingiswayo. Shaka joined the Izisya way, and from his first days, he stood apart. The other young men trained with throwing spears, learning to hurl assegais at targets from a distance, practicing the techniques that Nguni warriors had used for generations. Shaka trained harder, longer, with an intensity that made his companions uncomfortable. He ran until others collapsed. He drilled with weapons until his hands bled, and then drilled more. The humiliations of his childhood had forged something inside him, a need to prove himself that went beyond normal ambition, a drive that could not be satisfied with merely matching his peers. He also began to question what everyone else accepted. The throwing spear was sacred tradition, the weapon that defined Nguni warfare, but Shaka saw its limitations with the eyes of an outsider. A warrior carried only a few assegais into battle. Once thrown, they were gone, and worse, they could be picked up and thrown back. The long range that the spear provided also meant that battles became standoffs, warriors hurling weapons at each other from safe distances until one side decided to withdraw. It was warfare designed to minimize casualties, to preserve the young men that every clan needed for survival. Shaka did not want to minimize casualties. He wanted to win. He began experimenting with a shorter spear, a stabbing weapon with a longer, heavier blade, and a shortened shaft that could not be thrown. It required getting close to the enemy, close enough to smell his fear, close enough that the fight became personal and decisive, combined with a large cowhide shield that could hook an opponent's shield aside and expose his body. The short spear transformed combat from a ritual exchange into something closer to slaughter. His superiors noticed. Dingiswayo noticed. The young man from nowhere, the exile whose name meant parasite, was becoming the most formidable warrior in the Mthethwa forces. His first kills in actual combat confirmed what training had suggested. Shaka fought with a controlled fury that left enemies dead rather than merely defeated. He did not throw his spear and wait to see results. He closed distance with terrifying speed, used his shield to create openings, and drove his blade into flesh with a precision that suggested practice beyond what any training ground could provide. Dingiswayo promoted him, watched him, and began to see possibilities that went beyond one exceptional warrior. The broader political landscape of southeastern Africa was shifting during these years, and Shaka learned to read its currents. The Mthethwa were powerful, But they were not alone. To the north, another confederation was rising under a chief named Zwaid of the Ndwandwe, where Dingiswayo preferred to subordinate rivals and rule through cooperation. Zwaid was more willing to destroy those who resisted. The two powers were on a collision course that everyone could see, a confrontation that would determine who dominated the region for generations. Other clans maneuvered between the giants, seeking advantage, hedging their bets, trying to survive whatever storm was coming. Among them were the Zulu, still small, still insignificant, still ruled by Senzangakona, the father who had cast out Shaka and his mother so many years before. Shaka watched his birth clan from a distance, knowing that succession would eventually become an issue. Senzangakona had other sons, legitimate heirs whose claims faced none of the questions that shadowed Shaka's origins. But legitimacy was only as strong as the power that enforced it, and Shaka was accumulating power of a kind his half-brothers could not match. He had Dingiswayo's favor. He had a reputation that grew with every battle. He had ideas about warfare that were proving devastatingly effective, and he had patience. 16 years of exile had taught him to wait. Dingiswayo's influence shaped Shaka in ways beyond military technique. The Mthethwa leader demonstrated that unity was possible, that clan identity did not have to be the final word in political organization, that a skilled ruler could weave disparate groups into something stronger than any could be alone. The method mattered less than the result. Whether through diplomacy or force, through marriage alliances or military conquest, the goal was consolidation, one authority, one purpose, one people. Shaka filed these lessons away alongside his innovations in combat. A new way of fighting required a new way of organizing fighters. A warrior who closed with his enemy needed different training than one who threw spears from a distance. Regiments would need to function as unified bodies, moving together, striking together, pursuing together when the enemy broke. Individual glory, the traditional measure of Nguni warriors, would have to yield to collective discipline. The years passed. Shaka rose through Mthethwa ranks, commanding first small groups, then larger ones, earning respect from men who had initially dismissed him as an exile with no standing. He was perhaps 30 years old when news arrived that would change everything. Senzangakona, chief of the Zulu, was dying. The old man who had fathered Shaka in scandal and then expelled him in shame was finally facing the end that comes for all chiefs. The succession question that had simmered for years was about to boil over. Senzangakona had designated Sigujana, another son, as his heir, a young man with proper lineage and proper support, but nothing like Shaka's military reputation or powerful connections. Dingiswayo saw opportunity. A loyal subordinate controlling the Zulu would strengthen Mthethwa influence in a strategically valuable area. He threw his support behind Shaka's claim, offering the military backing that would make the difference between a pretender's ambitions and a chief's reality. Shaka had waited his entire life for this moment. The exile was going home, but he would not be returning as the unwanted child who had been driven away. He would be returning as a conqueror, backed by the most powerful confederation in the region, armed with ideas that would transform everything his people had ever known about war. The Zulu would learn a new name for the parasite they had mocked. They would learn it in blood. Sigujana's reign lasted approximately 1 month. Senzangakona died in 1816, and his designated heir moved quickly to secure the chieftainship. Sigujana had legitimacy, proper lineage, the support of elders who had served his father. What he did not have was Shaka's ruthlessness or Dingiswayo's army at his back. The assassination was swift and efficient. Shaka sent a trusted associate, Some sources say it was a man named Ngwadi, possibly Shaka's own half-brother through Nandi, to eliminate the obstacle. Sigujana was stabbed to death before he could consolidate power, before he could rally supporters, before he could become anything more than a name in genealogies. The killing established a pattern that would define Shaka's reign. Obstacles were not negotiated with, outmaneuvered, or waited out. They were removed. Shaka entered Zulu territory, backed by Mthethwa warriors, and no one dared oppose him. The same clan that had expelled him as a child, that had mocked his name and his mother's shame, now knelt before him as their chief. Whatever the elders thought privately, they performed the rituals of submission. Whatever his half-brothers feared, they kept their fears to themselves. The exile had returned with spears at his back, and resistance meant death. He was approximately 29 years old, and he ruled perhaps 1,500 people. The Zulu remained what they had always been, a small clan, one voice among many, significant only because their new chief served the powerful Mthethwa Confederation. Dingiswayo had installed a loyal subordinate in a useful position, nothing more. Shaka intended much more. The reforms began immediately, and they touched everything. First, the weapons. Shaka distributed the short stabbing spear throughout his forces, the design he had developed during his years with the Mthethwa. The Ikalwa, as it came to be called, named for the sucking sound it made when pulled from a body, replaced the throwing assegai as the primary weapon of Zulu warriors. Men drilled with it daily, learning to thrust rather than throw, to close with enemies rather than exchange missiles from safe distances. The large cowhide shield became standard equipment, its left edge designed to hook an opponent's shield and pull it aside, exposing the body beneath to a killing stroke. Then, the feet. Shaka abolished sandals entirely. His warriors would fight barefoot, their souls hardened through endless running over rough terrain until they could sprint across thorns without slowing. The practice seemed cruel, and it was, but it served a purpose. Barefoot warriors could move faster, more quietly, and with surer footing than enemies encumbered by footwear. It also imposed discipline through shared hardship. Every man in Shaka's army endured the same pain, the same callousing, the same transformation from soft civilian to hardened fighter. Then the formations. Traditional Nguni warfare was essentially individual combat multiplied. Warriors fought as men, seeking personal glory, their movements coordinated only loosely. Shaka demanded something different. He organized his forces into the formation that would become legendary, the horns of the buffalo. The chest, experienced veterans, engaged the enemy directly, pinning them in place. The horns, younger, faster warriors, swept around both flanks to encircle the enemy and cut off retreat. The loins, reserves, sat behind the chest with their backs to the battle, preventing them from joining prematurely, ready to reinforce wherever needed. It was a formation designed not for cattle raids or ritual combat, but for annihilation. Enemies who faced it found themselves surrounded before they understood what was happening, trapped between the chest that held them and the horns that closed behind them. Retreat became impossible. Surrender was rarely offered. The horns of the buffalo turned battles into massacres. Shaka drilled his men relentlessly. They ran distances that would have killed untrained men, 50 miles in a day over broken terrain, arriving ready to fight at the end of it. They practiced formations until movement became instinct, until the regiment functioned as a single organism rather than a collection of individuals. They learned that hesitation meant death, that breaking formation meant death, that disobedience meant death. Shaka executed those who failed to meet his standards, and he did so publicly, ensuring that everyone understood the consequences of weakness. The age regiment system transformed under his hand. What had been a social organization for young men became a permanent military structure. Warriors lived in dedicated barracks, separated from their families, forbidden to marry without Shaka's explicit permission. Their loyalty belonged to their regiment and their king, not to their clans or their fathers. The ties that had always fragmented Nguni society, kinship obligations, clan identities, local loyalties, were systematically severed and replaced with absolute obedience to Shaka himself. It was totalitarian in a sense that the Nguni had never experienced. Every aspect of a warrior's life fell under royal control. When he ate, where he slept, whether he could take a wife, whether he would live or die. The system produced fighters of extraordinary discipline and capability, men who would charge into certain death if Shaka commanded it, who feared their king more than they feared any enemy. It also produced a society organized entirely for war. The Zulu grew rapidly as Shaka absorbed neighboring clans. Some submitted voluntarily, recognizing that resistance meant destruction. Others were conquered in campaigns that demonstrated the terrifying effectiveness of Shaka's reforms. The warriors who survived these conquests were incorporated into Zulu regiments, their previous identities erased, their loyalty redirected to their new king. Within 2 years, Shaka commanded forces that dwarfed the original Zulu clan, thousands of warriors where there had been hundreds, a genuine army where there had been a chieftain's retinue. Dingiswayo watched his protégés rise with what must have been mixed feelings. Shaka remained nominally subordinate to the Mthethwa Confederation, contributing forces to joint campaigns, acknowledging Dingiswayo's supremacy. But the Zulu were becoming something unprecedented, not just another clan within the Confederation, but a military power that might soon rival the Confederation itself. The confrontation with Zwide's Ndwandwe that everyone had long anticipated finally arrived in 1817 or 1818. The sources disagree on exact dates. Dingiswayo led Mthethwa forces against the Northern Confederation, expecting a decisive campaign that would eliminate his rival and establish unchallenged dominance over the region. What happened instead was catastrophe. The details remain murky, filtered through oral traditions recorded decades later by men with their own agendas. What seems certain is that Dingiswayo was captured, possibly through treachery, possibly through his own miscalculation. Zwide had him executed, and with his death, the Mthethwa Confederation began to collapse. The system Dingiswayo had built depended on his personal authority, his network of relationships, his careful balancing of subordinate chiefs. Without him, it fragmented into its component parts, each clan looking to its own survival. Shaka lost his patron, his protector, the man who had made his rise possible. He also lost his constraints. The Zulu were now independent, owing allegiance to no one, facing a triumphant Ndwandwe confederation that would surely turn south to complete its dominance. Shaka had perhaps 3,000 warriors against Zwide's much larger forces. By every conventional calculation, the Zulu should have been next. One more clan swept aside in the Ndwandwe tide. Shaka was not interested in conventional calculations. The war that would determine the future of southeastern Africa was about to begin, and Shaka had spent his entire life preparing to fight it. Everything he had learned, everything he had suffered, everything he had built, all of it came down to this. The parasite was about to become the most feared name on the continent. Zwide came south expecting easy conquest. The Ndwandwe army that marched toward Zulu territory in 1818 vastly outnumbered anything Shaka could field. Fresh from destroying Dingiswayo and scattering the Mthethwa Confederation, Zwide's warriors anticipated another quick victory. One more small clan swept aside, one more chief killed or driven into exile, one more step toward total dominance of the region. They had heard of Shaka's military reforms, but reforms meant nothing against overwhelming numbers. Shaka chose his ground carefully. Gokokli Hill rose from the landscape near the white Mfolozi River, a defensible position where numbers would matter less than discipline. Shaka positioned his forces on the slopes and waited, letting the Ndwandwe come to him. When Zwide's warriors attacked uphill, they found themselves fighting exactly the kind of battle Shaka had trained his men to win. Close combat, where the Iklewa's stabbing blade outperformed the traditional throwing spear, where the Zulu shield wall held firm while individual attackers exhausted themselves against it. The Ndwandwe broke against Gokli Hill like waves against rock. They came in waves throughout the day, brave men charging uphill into disciplined formations that gave no ground, and each wave left more bodies on the slopes. By evening, Zwide's forces had withdrawn, bloodied and bewildered. They had not been defeated in the traditional sense. They still outnumbered the Zulu, still held the strategic advantage. But they had learned that this enemy would not break the way others had. Zwide regrouped and returned the following year with an even larger army, determined to crush the Zulu before Shaka grew any stronger. The campaign of 1819 brought the two powers into a final confrontation at the Mlatuza River, and this time Shaka did not merely defend. He had spent the intervening months preparing a trap. As the Ndwandwe advanced, they found the Zulu territory apparently abandoned, kraals empty, cattle driven away, food stores destroyed. Shaka had ordered his people to strip the land of everything that could sustain an invading army. The Ndwandwe pressed forward anyway, hungry and increasingly desperate, their supply lines stretching thin over hostile ground. When they finally cornered the main Zulu force at the Mlatuza, they were exhausted, starving, and fighting far from home. The battle became a slaughter. Shaka's well-fed warriors, fighting on familiar terrain with secure supply lines, shattered the weakened Ndwandwe formations. The horns of the buffalo closed around Zwide's army with devastating effect, cutting off retreat, turning an engagement into an extermination. The Ndwandwe broke and fled northward, pursued by Zulu regiments that showed no mercy to the defeated. Zwide escaped with his life, but his power was destroyed. Within months, internal rivals had killed him, and the Ndwandwe Confederation fragmented just as the Mthethwa had. The two great powers that had dominated southeastern Africa were both gone, and in their place stood a single force that owed allegiance to no one. The Zulu had become the supreme power in the region, and Shaka was just getting started. The years following the Ndwandwe defeat saw expansion on a scale that transformed the entire subcontinent. Clan after clan faced the same choice: submit to Zulu authority or be destroyed. Most submitted. The Kwabe, a powerful group that had long rivaled the Zulu, acknowledged Shaka's supremacy and were absorbed into his growing nation. Remnants of the Mthethwa Confederation, leaderless since Dingiswayo's death, accepted Zulu overlordship rather than face conquest. Smaller clans simply vanished into the Zulu identity, their warriors enrolled in regiments, their cattle absorbed into royal herds, their separate existence erased within a generation. Those who refused to submit learned the cost of resistance. Shaka's campaigns were not raids in the traditional sense. They were wars of annihilation. Defeated clans were not merely stripped of cattle and humiliated, they were shattered as political units, their men killed or incorporated, their women and children absorbed, their chiefs executed. The message spread across the grasslands. There was no coexisting with the Zulu. There was only joining them or being destroyed. The violence radiated outward in waves that historians would later call the Mfecane, the crushing. Refugees fleeing Zulu expansion crashed into neighboring peoples, who fled in turn, creating a cascade of displacement and warfare that spread across southern and eastern Africa. Groups that had never heard of Shaka found themselves fighting for survival against desperate refugees who had themselves been driven from their homes. The chaos spread for thousands of miles, depopulating some regions entirely, creating new kingdoms as displaced groups conquered territories far from their origins, fundamentally reshaping the human geography of an entire continent. One of Shaka's own commanders became part of this diaspora. Mzilikazi, a trusted general who had served with distinction in the Ndwandwe Wars, fell from favor around 1823. The sources disagree on the specific offense, perhaps withholding captured cattle, perhaps simply growing too powerful for Shaka's comfort. Rather than face execution, Mzilikazi fled north with his followers, carving a path of conquest through the interior that would eventually create the Ndebele kingdom in what is now Zimbabwe. He took Shaka's military methods with him, spreading the revolution in warfare far beyond its origins. By the mid-1820s, Shaka ruled a nation that dwarfed anything the region had ever seen. The tiny clan of 1,500 people had become an empire of perhaps 250,000, its authority extending over thousands of square miles. Its armies capable of fielding tens of thousands of warriors trained in Shaka's methods. The transformation had taken less than a decade. The society that emerged was unlike anything that had existed before in this part of Africa. Everything revolved around the regiments. Young men were enrolled in their amabuto as they reached maturity, joining units that became their primary identity for the rest of their lives. They lived in military kraals, trained constantly, and remained unmarried until Shaka gave permission, which might not come until they had reached middle age, if it came at all. Their labor belonged to the king. When not fighting, they herded royal cattle, built royal homesteads, and carried out whatever tasks Shaka required. Women were organized into parallel regiments, their marriages coordinated with male units when Shaka finally permitted them. The system controlled reproduction itself, ensuring that the next generation of warriors would be born according to royal planning rather than individual choice. It was social engineering on an unprecedented scale, the entire population organized around military necessity. Shaka governed through presence rather than bureaucracy. He held court, heard disputes, and rendered judgments personally. His word was law, not in the metaphorical sense, but literally. There were no written codes, no formal institutions, no checks on royal authority. What Shaka decided happened. Those who questioned him died. Those who failed him died. Those who succeeded might live, if they did not succeed too visibly and attract the dangerous attention that came with appearing to rival the king. The wealth of the nation flowed towards Shaka. Cattle seized in conquest became royal property, distributed to favorites and warriors according to the king's pleasure. Trade goods, beads, metal, cloth, passed through royal hands. The elaborate homesteads that dotted the landscape belonged to the king, staffed by women who were technically his wives, though he never established a primary queen or produced acknowledged heirs. The absence of an heir was notable, even ominous. Shaka showed no interest in establishing a succession. no desire to create sons who might one day replace him. Whether this reflected psychological damage from his own childhood, strategic calculation to prevent rivals from gathering around an heir, or simply indifference to what came after him, the result was a kingdom that depended entirely on one man's continued existence. For now, that existence seemed secure. Shaka was in his late 30s, at the height of his physical powers, commanding an army that no regional force could challenge. He had built something from nothing, transformed an insult into a name that made grown men tremble. The child who had been mocked and exiled had become a king, whose reach extended further than any Nguni ruler in history. But power on this scale attracted attention from beyond the world Shaka knew. Strangers were coming from across the sea, white men in strange clothes, speaking incomprehensible languages, carrying weapons that killed with thunder and smoke. They wanted to talk, they wanted to trade, they wanted to understand the extraordinary kingdom that had suddenly emerged on the southeastern coast of Africa. Shaka would receive them, and in receiving them, he would ensure that his story would be remembered long after the grasslands forgot the names of ordinary kings. The white men arrived at Port Natal in 1824, and they brought something Shaka had never encountered: witnesses who would write things down. Henry Francis Finn was a trader and adventurer, barely 21 years old, seeking fortune on the fringes of European knowledge. Francis Farewell led the expedition, hoping to establish commercial relations with the mysterious kingdom that had suddenly dominated the coast. Nathaniel Isaacs would join later, another young man drawn by opportunity and danger. They came with trade goods, beads, brass, cloth, and curiosity about the African king, whose name was beginning to reach European ears. What they found astonished them. Shaka's capital at Bulawayo sprawled across the landscape, a complex of kraals housing thousands of people, organized with a precision that European observers struggled to comprehend. The king himself received them, surrounded by regiments that moved with choreographed discipline, warriors whose bearing suggested training more rigorous than anything the visitors had seen outside professional European armies. This was not the primitive chiefdom they had expected. This was a military state of terrifying sophistication. Shaka was fascinated by his visitors in turn. Their weapons especially interested him. The muskets that killed with noise and smoke from distances no spear could reach. He tested the guns, found them slow to reload and inaccurate beyond close range, and concluded that his methods remained superior for the kind of warfare he practiced. But he recognized that these strangers represented something larger, a world beyond the horizon that might one day matter to his kingdom. He gave them land, a grant of territory around Port Natal, probably meaningless in Shaka's mind, since all land belonged to him and could be reclaimed at will, but precious to the traders who now had legal cover for their presence. The arrangement suited both parties. Shaka gained access to European goods and information about the wider world, while the traders gained a foothold in a kingdom whose ivory and cattle might make them rich. Finn became something like a court attendant, present at Shaka's residence for extended periods, witnessing events that he would later record in memoirs that remain our primary source for this period of Zulu history. His accounts must be treated with caution, written years later, shaped by literary conventions and possibly embellished for European audiences. But they provide details that oral tradition alone could not preserve. One such detail, an assassination attempt, probably in 1824, when an assailant stabbed Shaka with a spear. Finn claimed to have treated the wound, applying European medical techniques that may have saved the king's life. Whether the story is entirely accurate or partly self-aggrandizement, It suggests that even at the height of his power, Shaka faced threats from within. Absolute authority bred absolute resentment in some quarters, and a king who ruled through fear could never fully trust those around him. The court that the Europeans observed had become intensely ritualized. Elaborate ceremonies marked every significant occasion: the first fruits festival, the mustering of regiments, the reception of tribute from subordinate chiefs. Shaka sat at the center of these performances, surrounded by praise singers who recited his accomplishments, by warriors who demonstrated their readiness to die at his command, by women who danced in formations as precise as any military drill. The message was constant. Shaka was not merely a chief, but something approaching divine, the embodiment of Zulu power, the source from which all authority flowed. But rituals that reinforced power also revealed its limits. The military campaigns continued relentlessly, pushing further from Zulu heartland, demanding more from warriors who had been fighting for years. Regiments marched hundreds of miles to attack peoples who posed no immediate threat, returning with cattle and captives, but also with casualties and exhaustion. The system required constant expansion, new conquests to reward loyal warriors, new cattle to distribute, new peoples to absorb. But expansion had limits that were becoming visible. The army could not march forever. The young men forbidden to marry were growing older, their patience fraying. Shaka's inner circle narrowed as the years passed. He trusted fewer people, confided in fewer advisors, made decisions increasingly alone. The commanders who had helped build his empire found themselves watched, suspected, sometimes eliminated on pretexts that seemed arbitrary. Success was dangerous. A general who won too many victories might be seen as a rival. Failure was fatal. The space for survival between these extremes grew ever smaller. His personal life remained empty in ways that power could not fill. He had taken no principal wife, produced no heir, established no family in the conventional sense. The thousands of women attached to his households were symbols of wealth rather than companions. The isolation of kingship, which all rulers experienced to some degree, had become total in Shaka's case. The boy who had known only his mother's love had grown into a man who seemed incapable of trusting anyone else. And then his mother died. Nandi passed away in October 1827, probably from dysentery, and Shaka's response shattered any pretense of rational governance. The mourning rituals that followed exceeded anything in Nguni tradition. Shaka ordered that no crops be planted for a year. Milk, the staple of Zulu diet, was to be poured on the ground rather than consumed. Cows were to be slaughtered so that calves would know what it meant to lose a mother. Sexual relations were forbidden throughout the kingdom. Anyone found violating these prohibitions faced immediate execution. The killing began almost immediately. Some sources estimate that 7,000 people died in the initial frenzy of grief, executed for insufficient mourning, for appearing to show disrespect, for simply being in the wrong place when Shaka's warriors were enforcing the king's anguish. Women who were pregnant were killed along with their husbands, on the grounds that they should not bear children when Nandi could not. The slaughter was so extensive that some communities simply fled Zulu territory rather than risk being caught in the madness. Finn and the other Europeans witnessed the mourning from a careful distance, recording details that may have been exaggerated but capture the essential horror of what occurred. For nearly 3 months, the kingdom existed in a state of enforced grief that was indistinguishable from terror. Normal life ceased. The economy ground toward collapse. The warriors who had conquered an empire now spent their time ensuring that everyone suffered appropriately for a loss that was, ultimately, Shaka's alone. Eventually, advisors summoned the courage to suggest that the mourning had gone far enough. Shaka relented, gradually, allowing restrictions to lift and executions to cease. But something had broken that could not be repaired. The king, who had always been feared, was now seen as unstable, his judgment compromised by grief that had curdled into something pathological. The careful calculations that had built the Zulu nation had given way to emotional excess that threatened to destroy it. The campaigns resumed after the mourning ended, but now they seemed driven by something other than strategic calculation. Shaka sent regiments on longer and longer expeditions, pushing south toward territories that offered diminishing returns, driving his warriors to exhaustion for purposes that even his commanders struggled to understand. It was as if he was trying to outrun something, grief, perhaps, or the growing whispers of discontent that even absolute power could not entirely silence. The Europeans watched, traded, and took notes. They saw a kingdom that remained formidable but had begun to turn on itself, a king whose genius for war had not protected him from the ordinary devastations of loss. They saw opportunity in the instability, potential in the cracks that were spreading through Shaka's edifice. And they were not the only ones watching. In the royal household, among the half-brothers who had survived Shaka's rise, among the advisors who had seen too much and feared too much, conversations were beginning. Quiet, careful, deadly. The king who had murdered his way to power had taught his family well. They were learning. The last year of Shaka's reign was a kingdom holding its breath. On the surface, nothing had changed. The regiments still mustered at the king's command. The ceremonies still unfolded with elaborate precision. Chiefs still brought tribute. Warriors still knelt in submission. Praise singers still recited the great deeds of the man who had built a nation from nothing. The Zulu remained the dominant power in southeastern Africa, their armies unchallenged, their territory vast, their king's word still law from the Drakensberg to the sea. But beneath the surface, fault lines were spreading. The mourning for Nandi had exposed something that could not be unseen. Shaka had always ruled through fear, but fear had been balanced by success. Victory in battle, expansion of territory, distribution of cattle and women to loyal followers. The system worked as long as the rewards justified the terror. After Nandi's death, the terror continued, but the rewards dwindled. The campaigns that followed accomplished little except exhausting warriors who had already given years of their lives to Shaka's ambitions. The unmarried regiments bore the heaviest burden of discontent. Men who had fought since their youth were now approaching middle age, still forbidden to take wives, still bound to their barracks, still waiting for royal permission that might never come. They watched younger men join the Amabutho and understood that the same fate awaited them, a lifetime of service with celibacy as the price. Some had served for 15 years or more. Their patience was not infinite. The commanders shared their men's frustrations, though they dared not voice them openly. They had watched colleagues executed for failures that were not their fault, for successes that drew too much attention, for offenses that existed only in Shaka's increasingly erratic imagination. The path to survival narrowed with each passing month. Speaking truth to the king meant death. Remaining silent while the kingdom deteriorated felt like waiting for a disaster that would sweep them away, regardless. 2 of Shaka's half-brothers had survived his rise to power, Dingaan and Milangana. They had learned early to make themselves invisible, to avoid any action that might suggest ambition, to exist in the dangerous shadow of a king who had murdered his way to the throne and would not hesitate to murder again. For years, invisibility had been enough. Now it was not. Shaka had no heir. He had shown no interest in producing one. When he died, by violence or illness or simple age, the succession would be chaos. Dingain and Mahlangana had as much claim as anyone, but claims meant nothing without power to enforce them. And power in Shaka's kingdom flowed entirely through Shaka himself. If they waited for him to die naturally, someone else might move faster. If they moved too soon, they would join Sigujana in an unmarked grave. The brothers began to talk carefully, with a servant named Mbofa, who had access to Shaka's inner household. Mbofa had his own grievances. The sources do not specify what they were, but a lifetime of proximity to Shaka's paranoia would have provided ample material. The three men circled the unspoken conclusion, testing each other's commitment, looking for the weakness that would betray them to the king. They found none. The conspiracy held. Shaka seemed unaware of the danger gathering around him, or perhaps he was aware and simply did not care. His behavior in the final months suggested a man who had lost interest in the careful calculations that had built his empire. He sent regiments on distant campaigns that served no strategic purpose, depleting the forces around his person. He spent time with the European traders, discussing the wider world with what Finn described as genuine curiosity, as if contemplating a future he would never see. He issued orders that contradicted previous orders, punished infractions that he had previously ignored infractions that he had previously punished. The military machine he had created continued to function through institutional momentum rather than royal direction. Commanders carried out campaigns because campaigns were what they did. Warriors followed orders because following orders was all they knew. But the animating intelligence that had made the Zulu more than just another powerful chiefdom, that seemed to have withdrawn into grief or madness or simple exhaustion. Some who observed him in these months believed he was courting death. The man who had survived assassination attempts through constant vigilance now exposed himself to danger with what looked like indifference. He dismissed bodyguards, spent time alone, allowed people close to him who would never have been permitted such access in earlier years. Whether this represented suicidal despair, overconfidence born of years of unchallenged power, or simply the carelessness of a mind no longer fully engaged with the world, the effect was the same. The kingdom that Shaka had built was as powerful as it had ever been. Its armies could still crush any regional rival. Its social organization still produced warriors of extraordinary discipline. Its territory still dwarfed anything that had existed before in this part of Africa. By every external measure, the Zulu nation stood at its zenith. But a kingdom built entirely around one man is only as stable as that man's life. September 1828 approached. The spring planting season was beginning. Regiments were returning from distant campaigns, exhausted and depleted. The king sat in his kraal, surrounded by the apparatus of absolute power, apparently unaware that the men closest to him had already decided he would not see another harvest. The conspiracy needed only an opportunity. Shaka, through indifference or fate, was about to provide one. September 22nd, 1828, began like any other day at the royal kraal. A delegation had arrived to deliver tribute, and Shaka received them in the afternoon, conducting the routine business of kingship that had occupied him for 12 years. The regiments that might have protected him were away on campaign. Some sources say Shaka himself had sent them, clearing the space that would make the conspiracy possible. The bodyguards who remained had been reduced to a handful, insufficient to stop determined attackers, barely enough to maintain the appearance of royal dignity. Dingaan, Mlangana, and Mbofa had chosen their moment well. As the afternoon shadows lengthened and the delegation departed, the three conspirators approached. The details vary depending on which source one trusts. Some accounts place the attack in the cattle kraal, others near the royal quarters, but the essential facts are consistent. They came at Shaka with stabbing spears, the same weapons he had introduced to transform Nguni warfare, now turned against their creator. Shaka fought, even surprised, even outnumbered. The warrior who had built an empire did not die easily, but 3 armed men against 1, with no bodyguards close enough to intervene, could have only one outcome. The spears found their marks: chest, back, the body that had survived decades of combat finally failing against enemies who had spent months planning this single moment. His last words, according to tradition, were directed at his half-brothers. "You will not rule this land. It will be ruled by white people who will come from the sea." Whether he actually spoke these words, or they were attributed to him later, shaped by the knowledge of what eventually happened, they captured something true. The Zulu kingdom that Shaka had built would outlast him by half a century, but it would ultimately fall to forces from across the ocean that even Shaka's military genius could not have resisted. The conspirators did not give him a king's burial. His body was placed in an unmarked grain pit somewhere near the kraal, covered over, the exact location kept secret or eventually forgotten. The man who had transformed southeastern Africa, who had built a nation from an insult and a mother's love, who had drowned the grasslands in blood and glory, was buried like a criminal whose grave might be desecrated if anyone could find it. He was approximately 41 years old. Dingaan moved quickly to consolidate power. Malangana, the co-conspirator who might have been a rival, was dead within months. Some said Dingaan had him killed, following the pattern their half-brother had established. Mbofa lasted a few years before suffering a similar fate. The men who had murdered Shaka learned that conspiracy, once successful, tends to repeat itself. The kingdom they inherited remained formidable. The military system Shaka had created continued to function. The regiments still disciplined, the tactics still effective. Dingaan allowed warriors to marry who had waited years for permission, buying loyalty through the relief of pent-up frustration. He maintained the essential structures while moderating the terror that had made Shaka's final years so destabilizing. For a decade, the Zulu nation remained the dominant power in the region, but the strangers from across the sea that Shaka had supposedly prophesied were coming in ever greater numbers. The Boers arrived in the late 1830s, Dutch-descended settlers from the Cape Colony, trekking northward in covered wagons, seeking land beyond British authority. They entered Zulu territory expecting negotiation, perhaps conflict, certainly not the easy conquest that some had imagined. In February 1838, Dingaan invited a Boer delegation, led by Piet Retief, to his kraal, ostensibly to conclude a land treaty. When the talks ended, Dingaan's warriors fell on the unarmed visitors and killed them all. The massacre triggered a war that the Zulu could not win. On December 16th, 1838, a Boer commando of perhaps 470 men faced a Zulu army of 10 to 15,000 at the Encum River. The Boers had formed their wagons into a defensive laager, a circle of wooden walls bristling with muskets. The Zulu attacked with the same courage that had overwhelmed every regional enemy, wave after wave, charging into gunfire that scythed through their ranks with mechanical efficiency. By the time the killing stopped, the river ran red with blood. The Boers named it Blood River, and the date became a holiday in Afrikaner memory. Dingaan fled north and was eventually killed by his own people in 1840. His half-brother Mapande, who who had allied with the Boers during the civil conflict, became king, the only son of Senzangakona to die of natural causes, ruling for 3 decades of relative peace. His son, Cetshwayo, succeeded him in 1873 and faced the final challenge that would destroy Zulu independence. The British Empire wanted southern Africa, and the Zulu kingdom stood in the way. In January 1879, British forces invaded Zululand with the confidence of a modern industrial power confronting what they considered primitive warriors. They learned otherwise at Isandlwana on January 22nd, when a Zulu army of perhaps 20,000 overwhelmed a British column and killed over 1,300 soldiers, the worst defeat British forces had suffered against an indigenous enemy in the entire colonial era. The horns of the buffalo that Shaka had designed half a century earlier still worked, encircling the British position and annihilating it with spears and captured rifles. The same day, a small garrison at Rorke's Drift held off a Zulu attack in a desperate defense that became legendary in British military history. 11 Victoria Crosses were awarded, more than for any single engagement before or since. The battle became a symbol of courage against overwhelming odds, though the odds at Isandlwana had been equally overwhelming, only in the other direction. The British returned with more troops, better tactics, and the industrial resources that no African kingdom could match. By July 1879, Cetshwayo had been captured and the Zulu military system destroyed. The kingdom that Shaka had built was divided, weakened, and eventually absorbed into the British Empire. The last Zulu king, with real power, died in 1884, less than 60 years after Shaka's assassination. The man himself became legend, and legend is always contested. The European traders who had witnessed his reign, Finn, Isaacs, and others, wrote accounts that shaped how the outside world understood Shaka. These accounts were composed years after the events they described, shaped by literary conventions, commercial considerations, and the prejudices of men who believed they were observing savagery rather than civilization. They emphasized the violence, the terror, the mass executions, real enough, but perhaps exaggerated to satisfy European expectations of African despotism. Zulu oral traditions remembered him differently. The praise poems that celebrated his deeds portrayed a founder, a genius, a man who had taken a small clan and made it into a nation. The violence was acknowledged but contextualized. The necessary cost of building something unprecedented. The ruthlessness that survival required in a world where weakness meant extinction. He was not a monster in these tellings, but a father of his people, however harsh his discipline. Modern historians have tried to navigate between these extremes. Some see Shaka as a military innovator whose reforms transformed warfare across an entire continent. Others emphasize the destruction he caused, the Mafeking that displaced millions, the societies shattered, the death toll that cannot be calculated with any precision. Some question whether the European sources can be trusted at all, whether the Shaka they described bore any resemblance to the man who actually lived. The debate continues, unresolved, probably unresolvable. What seems certain is that he changed everything. Before Shaka, the Nguni peoples lived in a world of small clans and ritual warfare, cattle raids and limited ambitions. After Shaka, that world was gone forever. The Zulu nation he created survived his death by generations and remains a living identity today. Millions of people who trace their heritage to the kingdom he forged. The military techniques he developed spread across southern Africa, carried by refugees and imitators who adapted his methods to their own purposes. The political possibilities he demonstrated, that unity could be imposed, that clan identity could be transcended, that a determined leader could reshape society itself, echoed through African history long after his bones had dissolved into forgotten soil. He was a tyrant, he was a genius, he was a traumatized child who never recovered from the wounds of his youth. He was a visionary who saw a nation where others saw only clans. He was a monster whose grief for his mother drowned thousands in blood. He was all of these things, and the contradiction is the point. Human beings contain multitudes, and Shaka contained more than most. The grasslands of KwaZulu-Natal still roll toward the horizon, green after summer rains, golden in the dry winter months. The names of places still echo with his memory, sites of battles, locations of kraals, the landscape he moved through like a force of nature. Tourists visit monuments erected in his honor. Scholars argue about his legacy. Politicians invoke his name for purposes he could never have imagined. Somewhere in that landscape, in a location no one can identify with certainty, his remains lie in an unmarked grave. The man who wanted to be remembered forever, who built monuments of human suffering and human achievement, who made his name synonymous with an entire people. He has no tomb that pilgrims can visit, no memorial stone marking where his body rests. Perhaps that is fitting. Shaka was never about himself. He was about what he built, what he destroyed, what he transformed. The individual mattered less than the nation. The king mattered less than the kingdom. He would have understood, perhaps, that his monument was not a grave, but a people. The Zulu, who still carry his legacy, who still remember his name, who still debate what he meant and what he cost. He was born an insult, a parasite, a shame that his father's clan wanted to forget. He died a king, a conqueror, a name that the world would never forget. And in between, he forged a nation on the anvil of his own relentless will, hammering it into shape with blood and fire, with discipline and terror, with a vision that no one else could see until he made them see it. The child of the frontier had become the father of a people. That is his legacy. That is his curse. That is Shaka.